Thanks for joining, everyone. We're just going to get started in a couple of moments. So if you just give us your patience for a few minutes, and then we will get going. Elinor, I'm just going to check if you are there. It's a little hard for me to tell. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. When I'm screen sharing, it's hard to tell. Yes, I see you. I see you. Okay, excellent. All right. Well, in that case, I will stop sharing this holding screen. And I will also put my camera on. Great. All right. And we will get started once I pull up my notes here for our seminar today. Okay, so welcome everyone who's joining us remotely to the Global Media Policy Seminar Series. This is an online seminar series jointly organized between the Program in Comparative Media Law and Policy, that's PCMLP, at the University of Oxford, and the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. The series features insights on pressing issues affecting new media and human rights, particularly at the margins. We live stream these talks online to help bridge the gap between conversations happening in the global north and the global south in today's most important media debates. We hope you'll continue to join us for future seminars. You can sign up by visiting the PCMLP website or tune in live on YouTube at PCMLP Oxford. Today, we'll be taking questions here on Zoom. So if you are joining us in the webinar, please use the Q&A feature available in your Zoom window. And if you're watching the live stream on YouTube, please just tweet your questions to @OxfordMediaLaw. And I will try to keep my eye on both of those as we go. I'm Kira Allman, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in media law and policy at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies at Oxford, and I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Elinor Carmi. Elinor is a researcher, journalist, and ex-radio broadcaster who has a passion for technology, digital rights, and feminism. In the past decade, she has been examining internet standards, specifically the development of the digital advertising ecosystem, such as advertising networks, real-time bidding, and web cookies or pixels. Currently, Elinor is a research associate at Liverpool University, UK, working on several very interesting projects, including Me and My Big Data, Developing Citizens' Data Literacies, which is a Nuffield Foundation funded project. Whew, that was a mouthful.
You don't have to read all of them. It's okay. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. No. It's
I mean, if people want to see, they can just go to my websites. I don't want to bore people with a biography.
Yeah, and but I would definitely recommend checking out the Me and My Big Data project. It's a really interesting one. And also, if you'd like to follow Elinor, this is the really important information. She tweets at @Elinor_Carmi. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Elinor, to introduce your talk today. And we're all very excited to hear from you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen so we can begin properly. And let me know if it gets stuck or something, because there's nothing worse than, people talking and nothing moving. So first of all, thank you very much, Kira, for inviting me for this really excellent seminar series. I'm really excited to be here. And this presentation is basically a mix of my book, which was published in the worst timing of the century, probably in March 2020. And sort of what I'm working on at the moment, which Kira mentioned, which is the Me and My Big Data project, which is trying to understand UK citizens' data literacies. And to me, these two projects are very interlinked, because one of them sort of listen to what's happening in the back end of our screens, and the other one is focusing on what happens in the front end, so sort of how do people actually experience the way that our interfaces are designed. So I'm just going to start, and as Kira said, if you have any kind of questions, and feel free to leave them in the chat, or I think there's a Q&A, and I'm more than happy to talk about it later. So let's dive into it. Why focus on the Deviant? As you saw, that my book is about Deviant sort of media categories. And for me, I think throughout all of my career, I was always very much interested in the Deviant, sort of the things that are supposedly like evil or things like that. And in a way, I come from an assumption that nothing is inherently deviant or evil. And I sort of try to, if we're thinking in the comic world, the terminology, to the origin stories, so sort of what made a particular media phenomenon or category deviant. And so I want to sort of uncover and peel all of the layers and all of the sort of the discourses and institutions that made a particular phenomenon or a category as deviant. Now, I think that the benefits of exploring deviant media categories, or sort of the deviants, are several reasons. So I think that it's really important to sort of to peel off the politics of drawing the boundaries between what is a deviance and what is a norm. And so the questions that are kind of leading me here are: who created these categories, why, and with which rationale? Who does this category serve? And how do these categories affect the way that we engage and understand media? And I think throughout my projects, I was always very fascinated by things that, different kind of media companies, but also the law sort of landscape tell us to think about different things. I recently published several articles about sort of the myth of organic feed. And, we're being fed that organic is something that happens online. I'm going to touch about it a bit later. But I think that as media scholars, but also as legal scholars, it's really important for us not to take for granted different kind of terms that are being thrown at us, and to try to understand what's actually behind them and what is the politics behind them. So this involves, questioning what is a media phenomenon, an object, and project, and practice. So, when I started examining spam, there was hardly anything written on it from media scholars. And I was really fascinated by that, because I was trying to sort of to see why is that. And this project sort of started from there, and it expanded into different other media categories. It also sort of questions our methodological practices, because one of the things that I'm sort of arguing is that a lot of the things that are happening in terms of computing and interface design, and a lot of the politics of the internet or the web or internet standards, usually it's being discussed by computer scientists or legal scholars, and as media scholars are being told that we don't have enough sort of expertise to deal with those things. And I want to say that this is not true, and that it's really important for us as media scholars to engage with these kind of texts and to understand how different kind of power and sort of different kind of power relations are sort of structured and baked into these designs. So my book basically focuses on three types of deviant media categories. One of them is noise, one of them is spam, one of them is antisocial. And as you can see, I talk about these media categories in different time periods and in different media. So my book is open access. Feel free to visit the website. I also did a really cool playlist. So I really recommend you to check it out. And today I'm going to focus on the second case study, which is spam, the early 1990s and early 2000s, and sort of how this whole surveillance ecosystem that we experience every day, sort of how did it develop? How was it normalized and standardized? So in a nutshell, my book is about media power. Now, when we talk about media power, I think that one of the sort of more common way to think about and to theorize media power, especially when we're talking about algorithms and different kind of infrastructures online, we're thinking about it through optic and sort of visual concepts, right? We have and especially the panopticon, which is Michel Foucault's famous article and sort of famous case study, which I'm not going to delve into it. I'm sure that the people who are listening right now know that. But what I was very intrigued by that is that there is an overabundance of these kind of use of visual and optic metaphors, such as vision, invisibility, transparency, and especially I think the legal discourse, you know, when Frank Pasquale's famous Black Box Society. And for me, as somebody who comes from sound and music, I used to work in the music industry for many years. As Kira said, I used to be a radio broadcaster. So for me, the whole way of thinking about things and theorizing things was always through sound. And so when I was, you know, examining these kind of the things that I'm going to talk about shortly, I realized that the optic and the visual concepts are missing, and there's a different kind of shortcomings to them. So when we're talking about shortcomings of these kind of visual metaphors, we're talking about the inability of visual frameworks to deal with multiple actors, multiple spaces, multiple times, multiple purposes, and different kind of architectures. And I'm going to talk about it more, and you're going to understand what I mean more as I talk about my case study. So the way that I sort of developed my theory was by mixing different theories. So I used media theory, science and technology studies, software studies, feminist technoscience, critical legal studies, and sound studies. And again, if all of this sounds a bit complicated, then feel free to visit the book where I sort of analyze it and I show what I take exactly from each theory. And so basically, when I talk about the media power theory that I developed, I talk about knowledge production, which is a sort of a theory that is very well developed in science and technology and history of science. And I basically talk about two main processes. I'm talking about the production of knowledge, and then I'm talking about the ordering of knowledge. And I talk about it through two concepts that I developed: process listening and arithmedia. And each of these sort of practices involves different strategies, which I will not have, unfortunately, time to talk about, but I really recommend you to check it in the book. And now I'm going to sort of explain a bit about each concept, and then we're going to talk about these concepts through the case study. So process listening is a mode of listening whereby practitioners who can come from different professions and interests listen to different kind of sources by using several tools in different times to produce different kinds of knowledge. And what I mean by that is, for example, if we're thinking about Facebook, then Facebook listens to our behavior throughout time with different kind of tools. So for example, web cookies, which I'm going to talk about shortly, pixels and different kind of mechanisms in different times. So they listen to me not only today, but throughout an ongoing process in order to create a specific profile on me. Now, what happens after they create this kind of profile? This is when I talk about the second stage, which is after you produce the knowledge, what happens, how do you actually order different kind of things around it? When I was doing my research on it, I realized that when we talk about sort of ordering of information online, a lot of the terms that people use are quite sort of very fluid, and they didn't quite make sense to me because they don't really emphasize the politics of different kind of ordering. So we have, you know, flow and we have channeling, and that didn't really feel like that captures the very political and attuned way that these companies are ordering the way that we experience these platforms. So here, when I developed the notion of arithmedia, I'm influenced by Raymond Williams' planned flow concept, feminist technoscience notion of process. This is what I was talking about, this kind of ongoing process of but also listening to our behaviors, but also reorganizing how we experience these kind of platforms. And of course, Henry Lefebvre's rhythm analysis. So arithmedia is the way that media companies reorder different components in a way that orchestrates a desired rhythm, which is sociality, while filtering out problematic rhythms. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, again, don't worry, I'm going to talk about how this makes sense in the case study. Now, I thought about which case study to focus on, and I know that sort of Facebook is the more obvious one because everybody talks about it. But for me, it's actually very important to show what makes Facebook possible today, and sort of what kind of infrastructure were set that made Facebook and its business model as a viable thing that is happening. And so I want to take you into the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, where we had the dot-com bubble crash, and there was a shift in the kind of the business model that was popular by then, which was subscription. And it moved to a different kind of business model, which meant that our behavior was sort of sold to different kind of actors, and we were offered different kind of services and content for free. Now, I'm sure that a lot of the audience here knows that nothing comes for free, and we're going to talk about what made it sort of possible. So in that time, there were also discussions about spam. And as I said, when I started my research, I wanted to sort of understand, how did spam sort of begin and when were discussions around it started? So when I started to investigate, I wanted to understand, how did different organizations define spam? So the IETF, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force, defined it as mass unsolicited electronic. And Spam House, which I actually wanted to interview for my project, and they didn't want to be interviewed for my project, which we can talk about a bit later in the Q&A, defined spam as unsolicited bulk email. Now, perhaps one of the first sort of times that spam is talked about in terms of the legal framework is the e-privacy directive from 2002, and especially in the Article 13, unsolicited communication. Now, as you can see by this definition, there are three kind of components that make spam spam. One of them is that this communication needs to be automated, it needs to be for the purpose of direct marketing, and it needs to be given with prior consent. Now, at the same time that I'm talking about all of these setup and sort of the beginning of 2000, another really interesting thing happened. So when we talk about the kind of the business model that is developing, we're talking about, wait, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back a bit. After that definition of spam, when I examined how spam is defined in other places, I realized that actually spam has a lot of other definitions that were not included in the e-privacy directive. So when I was looking at the OECD, and when I was looking also at the European Commission, different kind of documents, I was seeing that spam actually is a lot of other things. And it basically, if you look about this list, everything that should be sort of illegal when you sort of create this new online market. So I wanted to keep this in mind when we go to the other phase that I'm going to talk about, which is, as I said, when we have this kind of online market, we need to have standardized tools, but also standardized measuring techniques and units of measurements. So the IAB, which is the Internet Advertising Bureau, did this kind of research, as you see in 2001, where they wanted to standardize how they measure people's behavior. Because at that time, there were different kind of inconsistencies in how different companies measure people's behavior. And obviously, if you want to make this a viable business model, you need to have everybody on board with the same kind of measurements. So as you can see here, all of these kind of metrics still apply today. But one of the more, clicks and unique visitors and total visits and page impression, but perhaps one of the more interesting standard and sort of tools to measure people was web cookies. And when I was starting to understand, okay, what is this web cookies? What do they actually do? I realized that something very interesting is happening here. So I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience already know here, first party cookies is when, for example, if I'm going for The Guardian, and then The Guardian sends a cookie to me because it wants to know what I'm doing on their website. And then third party cookies is when companies like advertising networks work with several publishers. For example, they want to know what I'm doing at The Guardian, on Amazon, on Washington Post, on Haaretz, and they want to understand my behavior across multiple places, across multiple times as well, to create a richer profile that they can then sell for different kind of purposes. That is third-party cookies. But what I realized with the web cookies standard, which is what you're seeing here, is that, you know, when you ask for a particular web page, you're being sent multiple different kind of cookies without your knowledge. And one of the interesting things about sort of examining these kind of internet standards was that the people who sort of developed this standard in the beginning, they said that actually maybe we should actually show people what's happening in the back end, but advertisers said, oh, this is going to confuse them, so let's not do that. And I'm going to talk about it shortly a bit more. So the way that web cookies were legitimized and standardized was through the IETF standards, as you saw there, but also through legislation. So the e-privacy directive, basically, some of the stuff that it says is that web cookies are a legitimate and useful tool, for example, for analyzing effectiveness of website design. And in this way, this kind of spying mechanism was standardized and legitimized through different kind of mechanisms. But for me, one of the things that I realized is that, you know, whenever you encounter literature about web cookies, what you see is that they define cookies as just a text file. But actually what happens with cookies is that it is a new form of communication. Because what cookies do is that they communicate within your computer. It's a form of communication between different kind of entities. So it could be the Guardian, or it could be the advertising network that communicates with your computer about predefined topics. So for example, which kind of behaviors they want to record and measure to create different kind of profiles. And this is quite important because if cookies are communication, then this form of communication, according to the law, would be protected. But because it's not considered to be a communication, it is not. And for me, one of the interesting things was, you know, to understand how cookies were sort of discussed at that time. And what you can see here from, I think it's The Wired, what they show at that time was, you know, the advertising, the chair of the IAB in the UK says, you know, cookies have been branded as spy tools or some kind of subversive software, but it's what we use every day. And I think that, you know, today, I think thanks to Shoshana Zuboff's fantastic book, Surveillance Capitalism, we're talking about these terms a bit more, let's say, bluntly and a bit more boldly. But I think we need to keep on talking about these things in this way, because at the end of the day, web cookies and the whole infrastructure that we're seeing here is a spying ecosystem that, you know, kind of was standardized in a particular point in time, which then allowed to other services like, you know, Google and Amazon and Facebook to say, well, you know, this is what we do every day, so it should be okay. I'm going to skip this and basically say that if we're going back to the definition of web cookies and spam, we notice that they're actually the same thing, right? Both of them are automated for the purpose of direct marketing and without prior consent. And for me, what I realized is that the distinction between them was really important at that time in order to create more precise measurements of people's behavior, because it was a way for sort of the legitimate advertisers to say, you know, this kind of practice is okay, and all of the other practices is not okay, which is quite important when you're creating a new online market sort of environment. Now, as I said before, one of the things that are missing, or sort of the shortcomings of the visual concepts, is that they don't allow this kind of the multiplicity. And what we see here is what is happening at the back end of our screen, which is dozens, if not hundreds, of web cookies that are sent into our computers without us understanding or noticing, because as I said before, advertisers at the time of the standardization of web cookies said that, oh, you know, people shouldn't really see what's happening in the back end. And I think this is quite a great way. I don't know if you said the left one is Privacy Badger, Light Bloom, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, and BakeCloud, which is a UK-based sort of ad blocker. And I always wonder what would happen if we would have these kind of mechanism as a default setting on our browsers from the beginning. How would that change how people understand and engage online? I'm going to skip this. And so what I was talking about so far was how different kind of companies produce knowledge. So this was the process listening part. And now I'm going to move to the Arithmedia part. So what happens after we create all of these profiles? And so what you see here is real-time bidding, which Facebook then sort of developed further into their ad auction. And basically that means that according to the different kind of perceived profiles of people, they rearrange how we experience different platforms. And this then relates to what I was talking about at the beginning, that when we get different kind of feeds, the way that we engage with them is through personalization. And personalization is this Silicon Valley ideology that can only exist because it is based on our profiles, and it is meant to, sell us and then, sell us this kind of different kind of advertising and different kind of ordering that will hopefully influence our behavior into a particular way. So, and a lot of the companies that are sort of involved in all of this listening and ordering are so many, and this is exactly where, when I was talking about the multiplicities, there is the ecosystem that involves this kind of the ad tech industry involves so many companies that as a normal person or even as scholars, it's quite difficult to understand all of the companies that are involved. So if we would go back to see all of the web cookies that were sent to us, and if you'll see all the list of the companies that are involved there, we wouldn't probably recognize half of them, if not even more. And now I sort of want to start to come to the, why should we care? How does that affect the front end, how I experience these platforms? And this was a very funny thing for me. I moved everything to Brave browser, which is a much more privacy aware browser. And then that meant that when I go on Facebook, and it asked me about cookies. And as you can see here, I noticed that the kind of the choices that I have are quite limited. So here it asks me, do I want to accept the cookies from Facebook? I have accept all, which is also highlighted in blue, or if I want to manage data setting. I, of course, want to manage my data setting. And then you see on the right what I can do, which is, again, accept everything. So as you can see, the kind of the choices that we have and the way that this interface sort of leads us is a very problematic way, because especially if you're in the European Union, you're seemingly having more control, right? Because we can press I agree or I accept or okay, but at the end of the day, this is the only way to experience these platforms. While at the back end, there's a lot of things that are happening that we have no idea about. And I sort of want to move you into what does that mean in terms of people, and what I kind of discovered as part of Me and My Big Data, Understanding Citizens' Data Literacies. What you're seeing here is the survey, and we also had almost 20 focus groups with people during the autumn. And what we found really interesting was that, if you look here at the survey, people say, I don't mind sharing my data. Well, actually, you see that a lot of people do care. They don't want to share their data. And a lot of people don't trust Facebook and Twitter. But the most interesting insight was, if you look at this part of the survey, that we asked, if you accept your personal information to personalize according to your experience. And a lot of people say, oh, we want to have a personalized experience. But then we asked people if they accept sort of being tracked over time, and all of them said that they wouldn't like to be tracked over time. And what we can understand from that is that people don't make the connection that they get this kind of the personalization experience because they are being tracked over time. And so, what was really clear from a lot of the focus groups that we had as well is that, a lot of people want to know more about privacy. And here you can see as well, we ask people if they think that these companies make it easy to change their privacy settings. And as you can see, a lot of people think that it's not. And a lot of people also think that it's not even worth changing their privacy settings because these companies are not going to respect them anyway. So there's a lot of issues that are occurring because of the way that this surveillance ecosystem and the kind of very specific interface design that we experience on the daily basis affects us. But I would argue that it doesn't only mean that we don't know how to change our privacy settings. It also means that we don't know what other things we can do and how we can experience these platforms differently, because we hardly get any kind of options to say anything. We have sort of this kind of a one-sided contract with companies, as you saw now, with WhatsApp. They said, either you're going to accept what we're doing or not. At the beginning, they were a bit hesitant. And even though a lot of people left WhatsApp for different kind of other messaging apps, such as Signal and Telegram, with Facebook and with Twitter and a lot of these other companies, we don't really have other alternatives. So it's quite difficult for people to engage differently, but also to imagine and also demand from companies, well, actually, we think that this should be different and we demand for it to be different. So, is this the only way that we can experience the internet and the web? Hopefully not. But according to the way that it is structured at the moment, with web cookies that are concealed behind this kind of slick interfaces where the default setting is always, to accept cookies automatically, and where we are supposedly given control by pressing only I consent or I agree, this creates a very problematic way for us to engage with different things on the internet and the web and different kind of apps. So I'm going to finish with a quote from the book, that deviant media categories are about the struggles to determine what is human, what is normal, and what is social. It is about what makes us as individuals in society. It is about the default settings of our lives. And I'm going to leave it at that. I know I was a bit quick, but I just want to leave more room for your questions. So if something was unclear, then feel free to investigate more. Wait, I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Yep.
Classic.
Classic.
Yeah.
How many times have I been on Zoom? Yeah, thank you so much, Elinor. That was such an interesting talk. And there are a million things that I'd love to unpack from that, because it was so rich, and yeah, there's just a lot, I think, that we can discuss here. So I'll use my hosting privilege to ask the first question, and while I'm doing that, I would encourage anyone who's tuning in to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box for us, and I'll try to catch those next. But something that really struck me is that there are lots of issues, as you say, that are kind of like the invisible part of our interactions with the internet. So I
would say silent parts.
Silent parts. Oh yes, the sound analogy. Yeah, I love that. Great. Yeah, so there's a lot of silent stuff happening behind the front end, on the back end of our experience with the internet, and it strikes me that a lot of what you were discussing is in the realm of language, sort of how we talk about these things, how we refer to these processes and tools and platforms, and therefore how we kind of understand them. And then there's also the issue of the materiality, kind of the technical architecture that is actually operating. And obviously the language is an attempt to explain that architecture, but then it kind of biases or structures the way that we think the architecture works. And so I'm just wondering, after all the time you've spent thinking through this, whether you have any, strong views or opinions about how our language needs to shift, especially in terms of talking about the issues that you look at in terms of deviant media.
Well, thank you. This is a really great question. I think that throughout my research, the first thing for me is it's really important to I think that when we talk about sort of technical things and computing and also legal discourse, there is this kind of notion of, oh, it's objective because it's the law, or it's objective because it's computing and this is how things are, because it's algorithms. So it's magically just happening and objectively without any kind of politics or economic incentives. And I want to say that this is not true. So for us as media scholars, but also in computing and law, I think it's very important to show these narratives are very much fueled and influenced by political incentives, by economic incentives, and there's always humans involved. So, when I'm talking about, the organic feed, and different kind of decisions that are made, I think it's really important that throughout these whole processes, there are humans who are making these decisions. There were humans that decided web cookies will be like that. There were humans that decide, that we have different kind of default settings. And there are people who are also deciding that we will have specific laws that don't make sense, or, different kind of consent mechanisms that don't work. So if we sort of peel off these kind of layers, then we can actually witness a whole lot of interests. And, and as citizens, I think it's quite important for us to realize that, because, a lot of us are very proficient in that. But when you talk with people, a lot of them are not aware of all of the things that are involved with that. So for me, the first thing is to, take away all of this, this just magically happens, and to show the politics and the economic incentives behind different kind of mechanisms that we use every day. And because we use them every day, it's so important, because today, the pandemic made it so clear, we have to use these different kind of digital systems and devices. So, if we do not understand that everything that we experience is a result of different kind of decision-making processes, then we can't say, well, wait a second, actually, we don't agree with the decision-making and we actually don't want it. And then I think that provides people, hopefully with some tools, to push back, or at least have some critical thinking behind it. Now, I know both you and me work around digital skills and, in this topic, so I'm not delusional to think that, once we have literacies, everything is going to be magically solved and, we can all be extremely happy and everything like that. I think this is such a complex issue, which, as you can see, is the result of almost 3 decades of ongoing design choices and legal choices that now, in order to sort of push back for it, we have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, the big tech companies have lobbyists in every point of the way to make, our cases, or at least people who care about, human rights and digital rights, which are the same, it's much more difficult for us to make a case. So, in the US, you have antitrust attempts, as well as in the EU. In the EU, you have different kind of attempts with the Digital Services Act, and all of these kind of trying to do that legally. But, the way that I see it, we have a lot of work to do. I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and I hope we'll be able to return to the skills issue in a moment, because I think that's so important. But I thought one of the best examples of just how political this issue is and how embedded in language it is was that survey data that you brought in from the Me and My Big Data project about how if you ask people how they feel about personalization, they're fairly positive about it, and but if you ask them how they feel about being surveilled, they're very negative about that. But of course, these two functions go hand in hand. These two processes go hand in hand, and people don't have their tech literacy. Even highly technologically literate people do not have literacy that extends to understanding how those two facets are interrelated.
And I think it's also problematic. Like, a lot of people, don't have the resources or the capacities or the will, and I think, we need more alternatives. So I think that for me, the WhatsApp case was actually a really great case in point, where people were like, oh, we have better options, which we can move now. And I think with a lot of other companies, such as Google and Amazon and Facebook, when you don't have alternatives, and a lot of people rely on that, whether it's, socially, or, if your work is there, or different kind of things, or if you're politically you're there, when you don't have alternatives, that creates a problem that people are, I'll give you another insight from our research. 100% of the people that we had in our focus group said that they don't post things on social media because they don't feel, comfortable enough. So that for me means that a lot of people, they have a lot of concerns, for example, about Facebook, and all of them said, I should also say that we focus mainly about adult people who have lower sort of literacy skills. And all of them said that they are concerned by Facebook, so they don't want to post things there because they're afraid, but then they are there to get different kind of information. So it's kind of like everybody says, oh, but Facebook is popular. Yeah, it is, because people don't feel that they have alternatives. So for me, it's also about, creating alternatives. It's different kind of measures, both legally, design, also, literacies, and also, of course, creating alternatives. So as you can see, it's a lot of things to tackle, and it's difficult to do it at the same time.
Yeah, we kind of need a cross-sector approach that really means that everybody kind of works in their field toward kind of shifting the narrative around these technologies, because I think that's the only way it'll probably happen. We actually have a couple of questions that have come in, so I don't want to dominate the conversation with all of mine. The first question starts with, hi, thanks for a great presentation. If I understood correctly, you mentioned personalization in advertising as a Silicon Valley ideology. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because while micro-targeting is the trend, at the same time, advertising could also be more effective or less annoying if it was based on the content piece more broadly rather than on the consumer's personal interests.
That's a really great question, anonymous person. But actually, there have been several cases now. I think there was an article at The Wired recently that says it's actual contextual advertising, which does not rely on spying on you, but actually puts advertisements according to the context. If I'm reading, an article about, I don't know, about alcohol, it would give me ads about alcohol. And obviously, and that actually proved to be much more beneficial. So, that I think that we need to think about different kind of business model. I think that, we just need to have more, just not one way to experience things. And so, because different, each business model and each kind of way to experience things going to have advantages and disadvantages. But as long as we have this kind of centralization and too much power of very few companies, which we can see now the problems of that, as we saw with Australia, where Google and Facebook basically act like mafia and basically threatened them. And I think that is when we should worry, basically. So I'm not overall against personalization. I just think that there are other ways other than spying on our behavior and doing these kind of really useless consent mechanisms that people just can't understand.
Yeah, well, I think it lowers the bar of consent so far to, it makes it so that the very definition of consent has been made malleable in new ways in this context. Would you say that's kind of one way of looking at it?
I'm just writing an article about feminist approaches to digital consent. So you will see a bit more about that. But for me, if you're in Europe and you just press I agree or I consent, that means that doesn't make any sense, because there's a great article of Mark Andrzejewicz, is one of the top scholars of surveillance studies, who said the big data divide. Basically, people do not have the processing sort of capacities to understand what is happening. All the real-time bidding, these are things that are happening within milliseconds. I, as Elinor, have no understanding, no capacity to understand, which companies are involved, what are they doing with my data, And also, what will they do with my data? Because these kind of things, we live in a very interesting point in time where it's not taken for granted that even if we are in a democracy right now, that it will be a democracy tomorrow. So, when we're talking about all of this data collection and profiling, we don't actually know how it's going to be used against us. Recently, we saw that people who protested, I think, against Ferguson, for George Floyd, that Google handed the people who were around the location data. So the police around there, I forgot the name, the place, but basically the police asked for the data of all the people who were around that location around specific times. So, just because you protest against something doesn't mean that your data should be given to anybody. And that's what I'm talking about. This, we're talking about, but only if we consent, or only if it's for good purposes, but we don't know how this is going to be used. And because there's so much data collection and listening to our behavior across time, we just have no idea how it's going to be used against us. And this is why it should be canceled, altogether, because it could just harm us in ways that we just don't understand at the moment. We understand it, it could be, biases of advertisements that we engage with, or it could be with, our credit scores or our ability to get a job or things like that. But in the future, it could also harm us in many, many other ways. And so I just don't understand what is the justification of that.
Yeah, it links directly to this other fallacy that we heard a lot around the Snowden revelations years ago, when people said, well, why should I be concerned about, my data being collected or surveilled? That I'm not a criminal. What do I have to worry about? But of course, data trails flatten our identities tremendously. So what data looks like is very different from what the complexity of human life really looks like, and that's something that's, I think, lost as well in terms of in terms of data literacy as well. So we have another question here from Giovanni, who says, amazing presentation. I work on platform powers from a constitutional law perspective. I would like to hear more from you about potential paths to unpack what happens behind the screens, how to create a dialogue between different rationalities, law, policies, technologies, education, etc., how to put together these different languages.
Thank you, Giovanni. It's a really great question. I think it's a really difficult one for me. The first move would be actually a whole new way of thinking about how we enforce things and what kind of legal instruments we have. Because at the moment, as a normal citizen, I have a very limited amount of things that I can do. Sure, you have activists like Max Schrems who are it's like a one-person operation. You have people who are trying to protest Facebook and different kind of things in across the world. But at the moment, the kind of instruments that we have is antitrust, or maybe different kind of fines of these, you give a fine to Facebook and Google and they make that within an hour. So it's obviously not very useful. I've said it, a lot of other people have said it as well, but I think that we need to think about online platforms and algorithmic ordering in a different way, where we actually before they make any kind of changes or put a different innovative technology, that needs to go through a kind of a specific board, just like when you have for pharmaceuticals, because it actually harms society. That would be a first step. The second step would be to design platforms in a way that is more meaningful for people, where they can actually engage and negotiate, because at the moment we have a one-side contract with these platforms, which, first of all, we can't actually read all of them because it's way too long, and it has a lot of legal jargon, and nobody can actually understand that. So we need to change these contracts in a way that it would actually benefit us as citizens, and where we can actually negotiate. Because if I don't want something, just like any other contract, I should be able to express that in a meaningful way. So We're talking about different legal instruments. We're talking about different interface design, and we're talking about different kind of training for people in an ongoing process. And I know that Kira is working on a really amazing project in libraries, which is something that I emphasize a lot in my talks as well, because, you know, we don't have these kind of free spaces where people can actually come together and learn different kind of things. And especially, you know, what we saw with me and my big data, if you're an adult, if you're like basically not in school or university anymore, and you want to learn, where are you going to go? And especially if you don't have any kind of literacy skills, there's very few places where you can actually do that. Some people don't even have like basic devices. So where are they actually going to learn in a safe and, you know, friendly environment? And I think that libraries are one of the last few places to do that. Unfortunately, in the UK, they closed almost 800 libraries across the state in the past decade, thanks to the Tories. So this is a huge problem. So for me, you know, we need different kind of spaces where citizens can come together and teach each other and create this kind of what we call networks of literacy, because people don't engage with people individually. They, you know, they do that in different kind of networks that make sense to them in their everyday practices. So if we actually create more spaces like that, that will be a good beginning. But everything that I'm saying right now, it's just the beginning. And we just need to have our governments being a bit more on board and not, you know, we can't take that away from the privatization of different kind of services and different kind of things that are offered for people. And unfortunately, you know, everything is privatized. So it's quite difficult where, you know, even governments are counting on Google or Amazon, these kind of things. I'm not saying that government is the only solution, but I think that the power that these platforms have is much more than any individual country. And at the moment, it's dangerous for the survival of our democracies, but also for our human rights.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence that governments themselves hold such contradictory positions on these issues. I mean, I'm so glad you called out the libraries, because as you know, that's really something that's very dear to me. But you know, the government, despite saying that libraries should be the go-to provider of digital inclusion, closed, you know, hundreds of libraries over the last decade, as you mentioned. And so there are kind of two different policy agendas there, warring with one another and creating a very confusing space when it comes to how to achieve digital inclusion and digital literacy, meaningful digital literacy, not a tick box exercise that people are kind of
not just like let's just throw some computers at them, or let's give them broadband, which isn't. Both of these things are important.
They are, yeah.
Because you give somebody a laptop doesn't mean that they understand and know what to do. And also, you know, in our project, where basically we have developed this kind of a literacy framework, which we call data citizenship. One of them is data doing, the kind of things you do every day. Data thinking, kind of critical thinking, but also understanding the online ecosystem and how it works. The other one is data participating, which is how, you know, you can help other people, but also do different kind of things like organize an online petition or a demonstration, or, you know, maybe even use the GDPR and, you know, collectively sue different kind of companies. But a lot of people don't have enough literacies to do that. I think a good example was actually with the A-levels and the algorithm there. And I think that was a really clear example of, you know, people understanding what are the repercussions of these kind of, you know, neutral and objective mechanisms, and how that can basically ruin your life. And you saw that when it does ruin people's life and they understand the consequences, they actually do protest. So I have hope for the younger generation, and hopefully we're going to see more protests with the fuck the algorithm. But, you know, I think that there's a lot of work, a lot more work to be done.
Definitely. And that's actually a great segue to our last question that we have time for, which is from Michael, who asks, given the network effects, can literacies make a difference without mandatory interoperability between platforms, including decentralized ones?
Okay, I'm not sure that I completely understand.
Well, Michael, if you're
But
still there, you can follow up if you want.
yeah, I think that as I said before, I think literacy is a really problematic area, and I know because I'm working now with the DCMS committee, where I'm supposed to help them sort of think about digital literacies in relation to the online harms now online safety bill. And everybody wants that, oh, one program that will save us all. But actually, first of all, it's really important to understand that for different people, different programs are more suitable. And also because things are progressing all the time, it's, you have to keep on being updated. And this is why I think that, we don't need to think about specific very specific skills like, in the past it was like opening an email or doing an attachment, but more about, what people need in their everyday life. And then to have these kind of sustainable long-term places where they can actually learn these kind of things, but also get support. Because if you teach somebody something and they don't know what to do with that after a week or after 2 weeks, if you don't have that support system and support mechanism, and people, they're just going to quit. And this is what we see with our, the people that we engage with, is that one of the important thing is that they have these kind of digital literacy centers where they go to, and they feel more safe and in a friendly environment because they can keep on asking questions if something doesn't work. And also, if something new pops up, they know that they have people to ask. And this is, again, quite important. And I think that governments need to provide these spaces, and libraries are a great space to do these things.
Absolutely. More resources for libraries.
Yes, exactly. My campaign should be together with libraries because, if you think about it, librarians and the library itself, they have a lot of skills that are extremely necessary for today, understanding the difference between credible sources and non-credible sources, understanding, if you want to examine or verify news and different kind of things like that. This is a skill that lasts for, regardless of the platform that you're using. And it's very important, and librarians have that. So, we need to give them more funding, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think on top of those very important skills that you just mentioned, it's also such a human issue. Bridging the digital divide is really about human skills, about communication, a lot more than it is about technology. As you said, everyone's looking for the technological solution that will just be the one-stop shop for solving digital exclusion. And that just doesn't exist. It's an extremely context-specific human endeavor. And so the fact that libraries have always been the human face of information, you can actually go and ask a librarian for something or ask a library staff member for something, that's turning out to be probably one of the most important aspects of their role in the digital inclusion ecosystem, if we want to think about it like that. So yeah, I totally agree.
And but it also creates this kind of community base, which is also something that, these online ecosystem, this personalization is also about individualization, because they want us to be the product and as a one unit, right? Like they encourage you to have one user with your name. And I think libraries create this kind of more community-based, where you can actually talk with a lot of people and do different kind of things together. And that is, I think, extremely important today. So
absolutely. Yeah, that is such an excellent point and a wonderful place to close out this talk. So all that remains really is for me to thank you, Elinor, again for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to host you for the seminar series.
Thank you, Kira, for the great questions, and everybody that was there and asking really great questions. And I'm just going to say again, the book is open access, so feel free to download it. And if you have any more questions, then feel free to tweet me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elinor. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.